Imagine living in a world where the night wasn't just a time for rest, but a time of fear. Darkness was more than the absence of light. It was a presence, a weight, something that pressed against your windows and doors. Today, most of us take safety for granted. We lock our doors, set alarms, and trust that behind walls and keys we can sleep in peace. But for much of human history, before locks became common and reliable, nightfall meant stepping into a world of uncertainty. Thieves, wild animals, rival neighbors, or even roaming bands of raiders could appear without warning. Staying safe at night required creativity, community, and sometimes desperate measures. How did people manage to rest when danger was always just beyond the firelight? That's exactly what we'll explore tonight. Welcome to History for Sleep, where we bring you long, calm journeys through the past, designed to both inform and soothe, so you can drift off while learning something fascinating. Tonight's topic is how people tried to stay safe at night, before locks and more. Together, we'll travel across centuries and cultures, seeing how people fortified their homes, relied on superstition, built rituals of protection, and even enlisted animals to guard them as the world outside grew dark. Before we begin, don't you forget to subscribe to the channel so you can join us for future journeys through history. It truly helps the channel grow and lets us bring you more content like this. I'd also love for you to comment below. Tell me what times you like to listen in, whether you play these stories as you're falling asleep, or if you enjoy them during a quiet moment in your day. And share what topics you'd like us to explore next. Your ideas help shape the stories we tell. Now, let's step back into a time before locks, before modern security, when nightfall meant vulnerability. The world was different then, and survival often depended not on metal keys or sturdy doors, but on the imagination, rituals, and resilience of ordinary people trying to protect themselves as they lay down to sleep. Nightfall in the ancient world was not a gentle transition filled with the comforts we know today. For most of human history, darkness arrived like a curtain falling across the land, smothering light and plunging villages, fields, and forests into an uncertain realm. Without electricity, without the steady glow of lamps or the hum of distant cities, night was absolute. It swallowed vision and muffled sound, creating a world where shapes were indistinct and threats seemed to lurk just beyond the reach of firelight. People in the ancient world understood that when the sun set, the rules of the day no longer applied. A person might work their fields under the sun and walk a dusty road without fear. But at night, the same landscape became strange, intimidating, and fraught with unseen dangers. The fear of darkness was not only practical, but deeply psychological. Across cultures, myths and stories consistently painted night as a time of vulnerability. Darkness was not merely the absence of the sun. It was a force, a living entity that concealed the unknown. In Mesopotamia, stories told of spirits that moved freely after dark, slipping through windows to cause sickness or misfortune. In Egypt, the nightly journey of the sun god Ra through the underworld was seen as a battle with chaos itself, a struggle that had to be fought again and again until dawn. For the Greeks, the goddess Nyx embodied the deep power of night, awe-inspiring and mysterious, a reminder that humans were small in the face of such overwhelming obscurity. Practical dangers reinforced these fears. Without locks or alarms, homes were vulnerable to thieves or enemies. Bandits moved under cover of darkness, knowing their approach would be hidden. Wild animals, too, prowled more freely at night, their senses better suited to the dark than any humans. A family sleeping in a small hut might be startled awake by the sound of scratching at the door, unsure whether it was a fox, a wolf, or perhaps a desperate stranger seeking entry. Even the creaking of wood in the cool night air could be unsettling, for without clear sight, the mind invented threats to explain the noises. Communities developed rhythms that reflected this relationship with darkness. In many rural societies, People worked hard through the daylight hours and retired early, often shortly after sunset. There was no reason to linger in the dark when every shadow felt suspicious. The day was for labor, and the night was for retreat. But retreat was never entirely restful. Families huddled close, aware that sleep left them exposed. It was a surrender of alertness, a necessary but dangerous vulnerability. This fear was not baseless superstition. In many parts of the ancient world, attacks or raids often occurred under cover of darkness. For nomadic groups seeking to strike at settled communities, night offered the perfect opportunity to catch people unprepared. Even within villages, disputes and feuds could spill into nighttime violence. A neighbor with a grudge might use the dark to settle scores or to steal livestock. These dangers meant that safety at night was not simply a personal concern, but a collective one. Communities learned to look out for one another, to guard against threats that came when vision failed. But the fear of night extended beyond physical threats. There was also the realm of the unseen, the spiritual dangers believed to stir when daylight receded. Many cultures imagined that the boundary between the living and the dead, between the human world and the supernatural, grew thin at night. Spirits roamed, demons whispered, and curses were cast in the hours of darkness. The very act of falling asleep was risky, for who knew what might slip past a slumbering soul? Amulets, prayers, and rituals became as vital as physical defenses, a way of erecting invisible walls against the dangers that could not be touched or seen. Consider, for instance, how early humans likely viewed the night sky. Today, we often see the stars as beautiful, distant, and serene. But to those without our scientific understanding, the vastness of the heavens must have been overwhelming. The moon could change shape, vanish, or glow blood red during an eclipse, events that carried ominous significance. Shooting stars, strange lights, or the howls of animals in the dark added to the sense that night was alive, unpredictable, and full of messages. Every culture sought explanations, and many of those explanations reinforced the idea that the night was dangerous. Sleep itself became an act of faith. To lie down, close one's eyes, and drift into unconsciousness required trust that the fire would hold, that the walls would keep danger out, that companions would wake if something stirred. Families and entire communities created traditions to make this act less frightening. In some places, people told stories before bed, creating a sense of connection and shared courage before venturing into the uncertainty of sleep. In others, prayers or chants were whispered as protective charms. The repetition of these practices soothed the mind, convincing the weary that they had done enough to guard against what prowled outside. The fear of nightfall shaped entire patterns of life. People built their homes with small windows or none at all, favoring security over light. Doors were fashioned to be heavy and barred, not easily forced open, even though true locks were still centuries away. Villages were clustered closely, with homes huddled together like a defensive wall. In towns and cities, gates were shut at sunset, and latecomers found themselves excluded until dawn. This communal sealing of the night reflected the shared understanding that survival depended on vigilance. Yet within this fear, there was also resilience. Humans adapted to the rhythm of day and night, learning to respect the power of darkness while seeking ways to coexist with it. They developed a dual relationship with the night, heart fear, heart reverence. For while night concealed danger, it also offered rest, dreams, and the renewal needed for the next day's labor. People recognized that to fear the night entirely would be to fear half of existence. So instead, they created layers of defense, physical, communal, and spiritual, that allowed them to surrender to sleep, however lightly. Imagine lying on a bed of straw in a small hut thousands of years ago. The fire in the hearth has burned low, casting faint shadows on the walls. Outside, the night is alive with sound and owl hooting, leaves rustling, the distant bark of a dog. You pull a blanket close, listening, waiting. Every creak of the house makes your heart quicken, but gradually, exhaustion draws you into slumber. You trust the watchful dog, the strength of your neighbors, the prayers whispered before lying down. And though fear lingers, you drift into sleep, as humans always have, vulnerable, yet determined to endure. The fear of nightfall in the ancient world was not weakness, it was survival. It sharpened instincts, forged communities, and inspired the first protective practices that would evolve into the complex systems of security we know today. To understand how people tried to stay safe at night before locks, we must first appreciate this primal relationship with darkness, a force that shaped human behavior as surely as hunger or the seasons. Before there were locks, before doors could be secured with bolts or iron mechanisms, humanity's greatest protector against the dangers of night was fire. The discovery of fire was not only a turning point in human history for cooking and warmth, but also for safety. To understand just how important fire was, we must imagine a world in which night meant more than inconvenience, it meant exposure. A camp without fire was vulnerable from every direction. A family could be easily surprised by predators. Strangers might creep close unnoticed. The cold itself could sap life from the body. Fire changed all of this. It was the first shield, the first reliable guardian that pushed back against the endless dark. The glow of flames cast a circle of safety. Within that circle, humans could see. They could move about, finish tasks, or simply feel less alone. Predators that stalked the shadows hesitated at the sight of fire, their instincts telling them to stay away. Even large animals like lions, wolves, and bears often avoided fire, recognizing it as something dangerous and unnatural. For early humans, this gave an incredible sense of control over their environment. For the first time, they could rest at night with a barrier not made of stone or wood, but of light and heat. In small camps, the fire was carefully tended throughout the night. People took turns feeding it with wood, ensuring the flames did not die. The act of tending the fire became a ritual of care, a duty that linked survival to attentiveness. In larger groups, multiple fires might be set around a camp, forming a protective ring that kept danger at bay. The glowing perimeter gave reassurance, a visible line between safety and the unknown, but fire was more than a physical defense. It also carried a psychological power. In the dark, the imagination easily conjures terrors. A rustling in the grass could be a snake, a stranger, or a spirit. A distant howl might mean a predator is already closing in. Fire gave the mind something else to focus on: the crackle of burning wood, the dance of sparks, the hypnotic flicker of flame. These familiar patterns soothed anxieties, anchoring people in the present and providing comfort against the mysteries outside the glow. Across cultures, fire took on sacred qualities because of this protective power. In Mesopotamia, temple fires were kept burning to symbolize order triumphing over chaos. In Greece, the hearth was guarded by Hestia, the goddess of domestic fire, whose presence was thought to shield families from harm. In Rome, the eternal flame of Vesta was tended by priestesses who understood that the city's safety was tied symbolically to the continuity of fire. Among nomadic peoples, carrying embers from one camp to the next ensured not only warmth and food, but also a sense of uninterrupted protection. Fire was not just a tool. It was a guardian spirit, a living presence that stood watch at the boundary of light and dark. Communities quickly recognized the importance of fire placement. In small houses, the hearth was the center of life. At night, it provided warmth, but its embers also glowed faintly, offering comfort even when the flames had died down. Families might arrange their sleeping spaces close to the hearth, trusting its presence. In villages, fires burned in communal spaces, like squares or central courtyards, where people could gather for safety. Some ancient cities even maintained watchfires on their walls, signaling to all within that the guardians of the night were alert. There are countless accounts of fire being used directly as a defense. Farmers placed torches around fields to deter wolves. Travelers carried firebrands when forced to move after dark. Even as late as the medieval period, villagers in Europe sometimes burned fires on the edge of settlements to ward off raiders or supernatural forces. In many cultures, festivals of light bonfires, torches, lamps emerged as symbolic acts of pushing back against the long nights of winter. The act of gathering around fire was both practical and deeply spiritual, a collective reminder that safety was not only possible but achievable with shared effort. The sound of fire added to its power. Crackling, snapping, and popping noises masked smaller disturbances. In silence, the smallest rustle might bring alarm, but with a fire, there was a steady background of sound, a living rhythm that reassured sleepers. The warmth of fire also encouraged deeper rest, protecting against the cold that could otherwise leave people restless and vulnerable to illness. In this way, fire became both shield and comforter, the first true guardian that humanity created. Yet fire required discipline. Its protection lasted only as long as it was fed. Neglect could mean waking to smoldering embers, the light gone, the protective circle broken. This meant firekeeping was one of the most important tasks in early societies. It was not unusual for communities to entrust certain individuals with the role of keeper of the flame, a position of honor and responsibility. Even in small households, parents would remind children not to let the fire die. The flame was life itself. It cooked food, warmed the body, and defended against the threats of night. Imagine again, lying down to sleep in a simple hut, the night heavy outside. A fire burns at the center, its glow flickering across the walls. The air smells faintly of smoke, a reassuring scent that signals protection. Beyond the doorway, the world is dark and unknowable, but the flames promise a barrier that predators respect. You listen to the crackle, watching sparks rise and fade until your eyelids grow heavy. The fire watches for you, its glow as ancient and loyal as any companion. Even as technology advanced, fire retained its role as protector. Oil lamps, candles, and torches extended its power into homes and streets. Cities lit torches at their gates, while rural households left small lamps burning through the night. The fire had evolved from a camp guardian to a more refined form, but its symbolic and practical role remained unchanged. Long before locks, alarms, or surveillance, fire was humanity's most trusted ally against the dangers of the dark. In reflecting on this, it becomes clear that fire was not only the first guardian, but also the foundation for every later method of nighttime protection. It taught humans that safety could be created, that the threats of the world could be held at bay with vigilance and ingenuity. The flames that flickered in the first hearths still echo in the candles we light today, in the lamps that glow softly in bedrooms, and in the electric lights that line our streets. All are descendants of that ancient circle of light that once protected small groups of people huddled together in the endless night. Before the invention of true locks, the most reliable way to stay safe at night was to make it physically difficult for anyone or anything to enter your space. People instinctively looked for ways to create barriers between themselves and the outside world, using whatever materials were available in their environment. These barriers were not sophisticated in design, but they were built on one simple principle: slow down, discourage, or completely prevent intrusion. For people who lived without locks, every stone, beam, or thorn bush placed in the right spot was as valuable as the strongest iron key would be centuries later. The earliest human shelters often took advantage of natural formations. Caves, for instance, were favored not just for their protection against wind and rain, but also for their single narrow entrance, which could be blocked with stones, brush, or fire. Closing off that one vulnerable point meant that families could sleep more securely, knowing predators or enemies would have to struggle to get through. Even when humans began to build their own huts and houses, they carried this principle forward, designed shelters with defensible entryways that could be covered or obstructed at night. In early agricultural societies, homes were often made of mud brick, timber, or stone. While walls kept out the elements, the openings, doors, and windows posed the greatest risk. To strengthen them, people leaned heavy beams or planks across the entrance at night, creating a makeshift barricade. In some areas, sliding bars of wood were dropped into slots to reinforce the door, an early form of latch that did not require a key, but relied on sheer weight and clever positioning. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and sometimes shuttered with wood or woven mats. These were not conveniences meant to let in fresh air, but tiny, controlled openings designed to minimize vulnerability. For those who lived in open landscapes, vegetation itself became a natural defense. Thorn bushes, brambles, or cactus plants were deliberately planted around homes or livestock enclosures. Their dense, spiny growth created a living fence that discouraged both animals and humans from approaching. In some cultures, villagers even stacked thorny branches each evening across their doorways or paths, removing them again at dawn. This nightly ritual was simple yet effective, turning ordinary plants into guardians. In larger communities, barriers took on a more ambitious scale. Entire villages were surrounded by ditches, earthen embankments, or wooden palisades. These structures were not just for show. They were built to slow intruders long enough for defenders to respond. During the Bronze and Iron Ages, many hilltop settlements in Europe were encircled with banks of earth topped by wooden stakes. At night, when visibility was low, these barriers were especially effective, because anyone trying to cross them risked tripping, injuring themselves, or making enough noise to rouse the sleeping villagers. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, where urban life developed early, barriers became even more sophisticated. Cities were often enclosed by walls of mud brick or stone, sometimes stretching for miles. Gates were shut at sundown, locking out not only potential enemies, but also unlucky travelers who arrived too late. Inside the walls, individual homes still relied on wooden beams and thick doors to secure their families. But the collective barrier of the city itself offered reassurance. The idea was that multiple layers of protection, first the city walls, then the neighborhood, then the household, would reduce the likelihood of intrusion. The barrier principle was also applied to the natural environment. Rivers and moats were used as protective features, turning water into an obstacle. Bridges could be withdrawn or blocked at night, ensuring no one crossed unnoticed. In regions with rocky terrain, people built their homes on elevated ground or surrounded them with loose stones that would clatter loudly if disturbed. This way, even if someone tried to sneak close under the cover of darkness, the landscape itself betrayed their presence. For nomadic groups, barriers were more temporary, but no less important. Camps were often arranged in circles, with wagons, carts, or animals forming an outer ring. Fires might burn along the perimeter, but physical obstructions like thorny brush or piled stones reinforced the line. Within this circle, families could rest more easily, knowing they were shielded from sudden attack. This practice endured well into later centuries. Migrant groups, traveling traders, and military encampments all used the circular arrangement as a way to create instant defenses when locks were impractical. Barriers were not just physical, but psychological as well. A sturdy door beam or a high wall provided a sense of reassurance, even if it was not impenetrable. The act of closing off an entrance before sleep was a ritual that allowed people to surrender to rest more easily. Much like whispering a prayer or tending the fire, it was a signal that the family had done what they could to protect themselves. That sense of preparedness, however simple, carried real weight in a world where the night was unpredictable. The use of barriers also reflects how human beings learn to work with their environment. Rather than relying on complex technology, they turned to what was available. A farmer who had no iron key could still pile heavy stones against his door. A family living near thorny plants could weave them into protective fences. A village near a forest could raise tall wooden palisades, while one in a desert might use packed mud walls. Each adaptation was shaped by geography, but shared a universal purpose: keep the outside world out at least long enough to survive until morning. It is worth noting that barriers were never perfect. A determined intruder could break through a door beam or climb over a wall. Wild animals, desperate with hunger, might push past thorn bushes or even leap over fences. But these defenses were often enough to discourage all but the most persistent threats. In a world where resources were limited, slowing down danger was sometimes the only achievable goal. Survival often depended not on absolute security, but on buying precious time to respond. Think for a moment of a small village thousands of years ago. The sun has set, and the last glow fades from the horizon. Families move about, checking their homes before retreating inside. A man drags a heavy beam across his doorway, fitting it snugly into its notch. Another lays thorny branches across a narrow path, ensuring no one slips through unnoticed. In the distance, dogs bark at shadows, but the barriers are in place. The community is enclosed by its walls, and within those walls, each household is further enclosed by its own defenses. People lie down to rest, not in perfect safety, but with enough reassurance to let sleep take them. Over time, these early barriers laid the groundwork for more advanced forms of security. The principle remained the same: control the entry point, create obstacles, discourage intrusion, but the execution became more refined. The heavy wooden beam across the door evolved into the latch and eventually into the lock. Thorn bushes gave way to crafted fences, then to stone walls, and later to iron gates. But in essence, these modern inventions are extensions of the same ancient instinct: to place something solid between the vulnerable human body and the uncertainty of the night. When we look back, it is remarkable how much could be accomplished without locks. With creativity and determination, people fashioned protective barriers out of wood, stone, plants, and even water. These defenses remind us that the desire for safety at night is as old as humanity itself, and that long before the first key turned in a lock, people were already building the walls that kept them safe in the dark. Even with fires burning and barriers in place, people in the ancient world understood that no defense was foolproof. A wooden beam could be lifted, a wall could be climbed, a fire could be smothered, and thorn bushes could be pushed aside by someone determined enough. There was always the risk that dangers might break through. Because of this, many communities learned early on that the most effective protection came not only from structures or tools, but from human vigilance. The watchful eye was as important as the strongest wall. And so, the figure of the watcher, the night guard, the sentry, the lookout, became central to survival in a world before locks. The role of the watcher was one of both honor and burden. To stay awake while others slept was not easy. It required endurance, responsibility, and often courage. The watcher was expected to stand at the boundary between safety and danger, ready to raise the alarm at the first sign of trouble. In small families, this duty rotated. One member might stay up for a few hours while the others slept, then wake another to take their place. In larger villages, people organized turns, each household contributing someone to keep watch during the night. This system meant that no one person carried the weight alone, and it spread the risk of exhaustion more evenly. In the earliest towns of Mesopotamia, records already speak of night watches. Clay tablets from thousands of years ago describe officials whose duty was to patrol the streets after sunset, ensuring that fires were out where they should be, doors were closed, and suspicious activity was discouraged. The presence of a human presence moving through the darkness made intruders think twice. To know that someone might be listening or watching was a deterrent in itself, much like a visible lock discourages a thief even today. In ancient Rome, the system of night watch was highly organized. The vigils were both firefighters and guards, patrolling the streets with torches. They kept watch not only for criminal activity, but also for the constant danger of fire, which could sweep through the tightly packed city at any time. The vigils walked their beats, their presence a reminder that the city did not entirely surrender to the dark. They were the human locks, preventing chaos from slipping in unnoticed. In China, night watchmen developed rituals that blended practicality with tradition. They struck wooden clappers or banged gongs as they moved through the streets, both to mark the passing of the hours and to show that the city was guarded. These sounds reassured the sleeping, telling them that vigilance was alive in the darkness. It also discouraged criminals, who knew the watchman's approach was not silent. The rhythm of the night was measured not only by the phases of the moon, but by the steady patrol of those tasked with keeping danger at bay. Even outside of cities, the need for watchers was constant. In military camps, sentries were placed at intervals, each responsible for a stretch of the perimeter. Falling asleep on watch was considered one of the gravest offenses, punishable by harsh penalties, sometimes even death. The reason was simple. The safety of hundreds, sometimes thousands, depended on the alertness of a few. A sentry was the line between rest and ruin. His eyes scanning the horizon, his ears straining for the faintest noise, he stood in place of a lock, protecting the camp from sudden assault. For nomadic families or small villages, watchers were no less vital. A father might stay awake by the fire, listening for the crack of a twig or the approach of footsteps. A mother might rouse herself in the middle of the night to check the door, ensuring the beam still held. In regions where raids were common, young men often gathered in groups, sitting awake with spears or bows, chatting quietly to pass the long hours. Their presence reassured the community, much as locks and alarms reassure us today. The watcher also had a symbolic role. They embodied trust. Families lay down to sleep, knowing someone remained awake, guarding their vulnerability. It was a form of communal reliance, each person accepting that when it was their turn, they too must shoulder the responsibility. This created bonds of solidarity. Safety was not just an individual concern, but a shared one. To abandon the duty of watching was not only reckless, but a betrayal of community trust. Religion often sanctified the role of watchers. In some cultures, watchers invoked protective spirits or gods as they began their shift, asking for sharp senses and the courage to act. In others, chants or prayers were recited at intervals, blending the spiritual with the practical. The very act of watching was sometimes seen as sacred, a living symbol of vigilance against the forces of chaos that prowled at night. This gave the role deeper meaning, making the burden easier to carry. But being a watcher was not without its challenges. Fatigue was constant. The body longed for rest, and the silence of night made it difficult to remain alert. Many watchers developed small habits to keep themselves awake, walking in circles, whispering chants, or tending the fire to stay active. In colder climates, keeping warm was an added struggle, as standing still for hours in the chill could numb the body. Despite this, the duty persisted, for everyone knew the risk of failing. Consider the picture of a small walled town in the Middle Ages. The gates are closed, the fires in homes burn low, and most people are asleep. On the wall, a lone watchman stands with a lantern, pacing back and forth. He pauses to listen, the faint sound of the wind carrying through the night. In his hand is a spear. His task is simple yet immense. If danger approaches, he must sound the alarm. Perhaps he feels the weight of the hours, fighting drowsiness, but he knows that behind him, hundreds rest in peace only because he remains awake. He is, in essence, the living lock on the door of the town. This reliance on watchers shaped human communities for millennia. Even when locks began to appear, night watchmen did not vanish. The role persisted because human vigilance could never be replaced entirely by technology. A lock could bar a door, but it could not patrol a street, listen for danger, or reassure an anxious community with its steady presence. It was the combination of barriers, fire, and human watchfulness that created the layered defense people needed. The concept of watchers has echoes even today. Security guards, police patrols, and night shifts in hospitals or factories all carry the same weight of responsibility. They are the inheritors of a tradition that began long before locks existed, the tradition of staying awake while others sleep, ensuring that vulnerability does not turn into tragedy. It is a role that connects us to our ancestors, reminding us that safety has always depended as much on human attention as on physical defenses. The watchers of the past, standing in the chill air with torches or spears, may seem distant from us, but their legacy lives on. They were the locks before locks, the alarms before alarms, the steady eyes in the dark that allowed families and communities to surrender to sleep. Their presence reassured the fearful, their vigilance gave courage, and their sacrifice built the foundation for every form of nighttime safety that followed. Long before locks and alarms, one of the most reliable ways to feel secure at night was to trust in the sharp senses of animals. Where humans failed, our eyesight too poor for darkness, our hearing too dull to catch faint rustles, animals excelled. Dogs barked, geese honked, donkeys brayed, and even roosters crowed at disturbances. These creatures became the living alarms of the ancient world, the guardians who stayed alert when their human companions sought sleep. Their partnership with people shaped not only the way households were kept safe, but also the bond between species that continues to this day. The most enduring and widespread of these guardians was, of course, the dog. Archaeological evidence suggests that dogs were domesticated thousands of years ago, first as hunting companions and later as protectors of hearth and home. By the time agricultural societies took root, the role of dogs as night guardians was already well established. Their keen sense of hearing and smell made them ideal for detecting threats long before humans could. A dog's sudden growl or bark could rouse a household, buying precious time to prepare. Even if the dog could not fend off an intruder, its alarm alone was often enough to deter trouble. But dogs were far from the only animals used for protection. In ancient Rome, geese famously served as guardians. One well-known story tells of the sacred geese of Juno's temple. When invaders attempted to sneak into the city at night, the geese raised a commotion that alerted the defenders, saving Rome from disaster. Though the tale may be embellished, it reflects a truth. Geese, with their loud calls and territorial nature, made excellent living alarms. Their honking could carry through the night, impossible to ignore, ensuring that no intruder approached quietly. Other animals served similar purposes in different regions. Donkeys, for instance, were often tethered near stables or barns. Though not fierce fighters, they were notoriously quick to bray at unusual sounds, creating a racket that would wake even the deepest sleeper. Chickens and roosters, too, were alert to disturbances, their sudden outbursts breaking the silence of night. In rural households where livestock and humans often shared close quarters, the collective vigilance of animals created an early warning system more reliable than any lock. The relationship between humans and guard animals was not only practical, but also deeply emotional. Families grew attached to the creatures that shared their homes and watched over them in the dark. Dogs were praised, fed, and honored for their loyalty. In some cultures, protective animals were considered sacred or symbolic. The Egyptians associated dogs and jackals with Anubis, the god who guided souls through the afterlife, reflecting their role as guardians of thresholds. In China, dogs were believed to ward off evil spirits, their presence at the doorway protecting both the physical and spiritual safety of the household. Even cats, though less obvious as guardians, played a role in nighttime security. In ancient Egypt, cats were treasured not only for their ability to control pests, but also for their mysterious watchfulness. A cat's unblinking gaze and sudden alertness to movements unseen by humans gave people reassurance that they were not entirely defenseless against hidden dangers. While cats were not noisy alarm systems like dogs or geese, their behavior often alerted owners to subtle disturbances, from rodents to strangers. The use of animals as guardians extended beyond households to entire communities. Shepherds relied on large, powerful dogs to protect flocks at night. Breeds, such as the ancestors of today's mastiffs and sheepdogs, were bred specifically for their ability to defend against wolves and raiders. These animals lived among the flocks, ever watchful, their loyalty tied to both the animals they protected and the humans who depended on them. In mountainous regions of Europe and Asia, these guardian dogs were often the first line of defense, standing between predators and vulnerable herds. Guard animals were also used in military contexts. Armies sometimes kept dogs in their camps to alert soldiers of intruders. Ancient sources describe war dogs trained to bark at strangers, their presence doubling as both alarm and deterrent. In some cases, dogs were even trained for combat, though their most valuable service remained their vigilance at night. Horses, too, could sometimes serve as guardians. Though not traditionally considered watch animals, their sensitivity to movement and noise often caused them to stamp, snort, or whinny at disturbances, alerting their handlers. The reliance on animals reflects a broader truth about human vulnerability. Alone, a sleeping person was defenseless. With animals nearby, however, they had an extra layer of awareness, a set of senses that never fully rested. This partnership was mutually beneficial. Humans offered food, shelter, and companionship. Animals offered protection and early warning. Over time, this bond deepened, becoming part of daily life and cultural identity. The value of guard animals was so deeply recognized that in some places, laws even protected them. In early European communities, harming another person's guard dog could be considered a serious offense, as it directly endangered the household's security. In other regions, families were judged by the quality of their animals, with strong, alert dogs seen as a sign of responsibility and preparedness. The choice to keep animals was as much a statement of prudence as it was of companionship. Imagine for a moment lying in a small cottage centuries ago. The door is barred with a heavy beam, the fire smolders in the hearth, and outside the night is filled with sounds. Beyond the door, a dog lies curled, ears twitching at every rustle. Suddenly, it stiffens and lets out a sharp bark, waking the household. Perhaps it was nothing more than a fox nosing at the livestock pen, or perhaps it was something more sinister. Either way, the alarm has sounded, and danger will not pass unnoticed. The family breathes easier, knowing their guardian is awake even as they drift back into slumber. The tradition of using animals as protectors has endured into the present day. Guard dogs remain a common choice for households and farms, their loyalty and vigilance unchanged across millennia. Even in urban settings, pets often act as deterrents, their bark alone discouraging would-be intruders. In rural areas, geese are still kept by some farmers as guardians of barns and yards, their loud cries startling trespassers. The role of animals as protectors may have been supplemented by locks, alarms, and technology, but it has never disappeared. At its heart, the reliance on animals as night guardians speaks to a deep truth about the human condition. We have always been vulnerable in sleep, and we have always sought companions to help shoulder that vulnerability. Animals filled that role naturally, bridging the gap between the limited human senses and the boundless uncertainties of the night. They were the living locks, the guardians of thresholds, and the companions who kept fear at bay with their presence. Long before keys turned in doors or alarms beeped on walls, a bark in the night or the honk of a goose reassured people that they were not alone. It is a reminder that safety has never been purely a matter of technology. It has always been about trust in companions, trust in community, and trust in the bonds between humans and the animals who chose to share their lives. When we think of safety at night, it's easy to imagine walls, gates, or watchmen, but sometimes the most important protection came not from structures or guardians, but from the way people chose to sleep. How and where families rested at night was a deliberate act of defense, shaped by the awareness that vulnerability in sleep could invite danger. Long before locks were common, people relied on closeness, positioning, and clever arrangements to keep themselves as secure as possible. In small households, the first principle of safety was togetherness. Families often slept in the same room, sometimes even on the same bed platform or floor space. This was practical, as warmth could be shared in colder climates, but it was also strategic. Sleeping together meant that if one person stirred or heard a sound, others would awaken too. A family might be roused in seconds by the cry of a child, the bark of a dog, or the scrape of something at the door. This collective awareness created a living alarm system, where the proximity of bodies meant that danger rarely went unnoticed for long. In many cultures, houses were designed with this closeness in mind. Ancient peasant cottages, for instance, often had a single large room where the entire family, along with animals like goats or chickens, might spend the night. The arrangement was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was secure. Livestock inside added warmth and provided extra ears for danger, while the clustering of humans created a united front. It was harder for an intruder to approach unnoticed when the smallest stir could wake not just one person, but an entire household. Sleeping positions also carried protective meaning. In some traditions, parents placed children in the center of the group, surrounded by adults. This arrangement shielded the most vulnerable, ensuring that any danger would have to pass through layers of protection before reaching them. Weapons, if available, were often kept within reach of the outermost sleepers, while fire or lamps were positioned where they could cast light over the group. Every element of the arrangement reflected careful thought about safety, honed over generations. In regions where raids or wild animals were a constant threat, people sometimes chose elevated sleeping spaces. Lofts or raised platforms offered both distance from the ground and a better vantage point. In parts of Asia, elevated wooden houses not only protected against floods and pests, but also created a barrier against intruders, who would have to climb ladders to reach the sleeping quarters. These ladders could be pulled up at night, leaving the household effectively sealed above ground. In other places, people slept on rooftops during warm seasons. While this exposed them to the open sky, it also made surprise attacks more difficult, as anyone attempting to climb upward risked being noticed. In desert regions, such as Mesopotamia, rooftops were also popular for sleep. The air inside mud brick houses could grow stifling, so families spread mats on the roof to catch the breeze. While this left them exposed to the elements, the height provided a degree of security. From the roof, a family could see anyone approaching long before they reached the door. It was a compromise comfort mixed with vigilance that reflected the dual concerns of rest and safety. Military traditions influenced sleeping arrangements as well. In traveling armies, soldiers often slept in tight formations, with their shields and weapons beside them. Camps were arranged in circles or squares, with the most vulnerable supplies, wounded men, or officers placed at the center. The outer layers of sleepers formed a protective barrier backed by sentries. This organization was not only practical but reassuring, allowing men to surrender to rest with the knowledge that their very arrangement offered security. Even in peacetime, echoes of these military patterns could be found. Villagers traveling together often camped in clusters, arranging their sleeping mats in circles with fires at the center. Each person knew their place, and the collective design meant that no one was isolated or left exposed. In such groups, sleep became a communal act of trust, shaped by centuries of experience with danger. Spiritual beliefs also influenced where and how people chose to sleep. In some cultures, people avoided sleeping with their feet pointing toward the door, believing this left them vulnerable to spirits or intruders. Others preferred to sleep with their heads facing inward, toward the hearth or family members, symbolically turning away from the outside world. Beds were sometimes aligned according to religious principles, with certain directions believed to offer protection or good fortune. These customs, while rooted in belief, also carried the practical benefit of creating predictable, orderly sleeping patterns that reinforced safety. The communal nature of sleep meant that privacy, as we understand it today, was rare. A single room could house parents, children, and sometimes extended relatives. While this might seem restrictive, it reflected a culture in which survival outweighed personal space. The warmth of bodies, the reassurance of company, and the shared awareness of danger created a sense of collective defense. To sleep alone was a luxury few could afford, and often it was seen as reckless or dangerous. Of course, not all arrangements were ideal. Crowding could bring discomfort, and sickness spread more easily when people slept so close together. But the trade-off was considered worthwhile. Safety at night was always a balance between vulnerability and comfort. Families accepted the inconveniences because they knew that being roused together was better than facing danger apart. Imagine a rural household in medieval Europe. The day's labor has ended, and the fire burns low. The family lies down on a straw mattress spread across the floor. The children are placed between the parents, while the family's one or two animals huddle near the door. A wooden beam secures the entrance, but the true defense lies in the closeness of those inside. If a sound comes in the night, the creak of the door, the bark of the dog, the cry of a rooster, everyone will wait together, alert and ready. The arrangement itself is a kind of living shield, a reminder that in the absence of locks, unity was protection. In wealthier homes, sleeping arrangements could be more elaborate, but the principle was the same. Even nobles often kept servants sleeping in nearby chambers or at the foot of the bed, both for service and security. The idea of leaving a master unguarded at night was unthinkable. Castles, though fortified, still relied on careful placement of guards, attendants, and family members, each positioned to maximize safety. Whether in a peasant's hut or a lord's hall, the recognition of vulnerability shaped how sleep unfolded. Over time, as locks and fortified doors became more reliable, sleeping arrangements began to change. Privacy became more common, with separate rooms for different family members. But the echoes of older practices remained. Even today, many people feel safer sleeping near loved ones or find comfort in the presence of a pet at their side. The instinct to cluster for safety is deeply ingrained, a remnant of a time when togetherness was the strongest defense against the dangers of the night. The story of sleeping arrangements reminds us that safety has always been as much about human connection as about physical defenses. Families drew strength from each other, arranging their lives to protect the vulnerable and share responsibility for vigilance. In the quiet hours of night, when fire burned low and barriers could only do so much, it was the closeness of loved ones that gave the deepest reassurance. Even with fires burning, barriers in place, and animals standing guard, many people in the ancient and medieval world felt that something more was needed to keep danger away at night. The darkness was not only home to thieves and predators, but also to forces less tangible spirits, curses, and unseen presences that seemed to move freely when the sun disappeared. To face these unseen threats, families turned to rituals, charms, and superstitions, layering spiritual protection over their physical defenses. For countless generations, these practices were as essential as beams across doors or dogs at the threshold, shaping the nightly rhythm of human life. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest cradles of civilization, people believed that demons and restless spirits prowled the night. Clay tablets from thousands of years ago preserve prayers and incantations meant to be spoken before sleep. Some households placed small protective figurines, often representing gods or guardian spirits, at doorways and windows. These little statues were not decorations, but watchful protectors, believed to ward off malevolent beings. Families also burned incense or recited chants, filling the air with scents and words thought to form an invisible barrier against danger. The Egyptians, too, believed in the power of ritual. They often painted protective symbols on walls or wore amulets shaped like the eye of Horus, a symbol believed to repel evil. At night, mothers whispered prayers over their children, invoking deities to keep watch as they slept. Certain hieroglyphs, carved or drawn near sleeping spaces, were thought to carry protective energy. For the Egyptians, night was not only a time of rest, but a daily confrontation with the forces of chaos, which Ra himself battled in his nightly voyage through the underworld. To guard their households, people mirrored the gods, performing their own small rituals to keep order intact until dawn. In Greece and Rome, the practice of invoking household gods before bed was common. Families made offerings to their Lares and Penates, the spirits believed to guard the home and family. Before extinguishing the lamp, some would whisper brief prayers, ensuring the goodwill of these unseen guardians. Romans also used charms, sometimes tying bells or small objects above the bed to ward off spirits. The ringing of a bell, like the barking of a dog, was thought to drive away evil presences. Superstitions like these blurred the line between the physical and the spiritual. A bell might frighten a thief, but it might also scare off a wandering ghost. In medieval Europe, rituals for nighttime safety became deeply entwined with Christian belief. Families crossed themselves before bed, whispered prayers to angels, or hung crucifixes above their doors and beds. Holy water was sprinkled in corners of the room, especially for infants, who were believed to be more vulnerable to spirits or the devil's influence. Some people placed iron objects, such as knives or scissors, under pillows or near doorways, believing that iron repelled supernatural beings. Windows might be marked with chalk crosses, a simple gesture thought to keep witches or demons from slipping inside. These rituals may sound quaint today, but they gave people profound reassurance in a world where night was full of unknowns. Superstitions often reflected local fears. In parts of Europe, people believed in nightmares caused by spirits that pressed upon sleepers' chests, leaving them breathless. To protect against this, families placed shoes by the bed pointing outward, confusing the spirit and driving it away. In Slavic regions, garlic was hung above doors or near sleeping spaces to repel malevolent beings. In parts of Asia, mirrors were positioned to reflect bad spirits, preventing them from entering homes. Every culture had its own versions, but all shared the belief that sleep left one exposed, and that unseen protections were as necessary as physical ones. Children were often the focus of special rituals. Lullabies, for example, were not only meant to soothe but also to protect. Many contained words invoking blessings, divine guardianship, or protection from spirits. Cradles might be rocked with chants that doubled as charms, surrounding the child with both comfort and defense. Mothers tied amulets around infants' necks or wrists, believing these small objects carried power to ward off harm. The simple act of singing a child to sleep became a form of nightly magic, a way to push back against the unseen dangers of the dark. Travelers, too, relied on rituals for safety when far from home. Alone in strange inns or under the open sky, they whispered prayers or carried charms with them. Some drew protective symbols in the dirt around their sleeping area, creating a spiritual fence, much like the physical ones used by villagers. Pilgrims might carry relics of saints, trusting in their power to keep harm away. Even seasoned warriors, hardened to physical danger, often placed faith in these invisible shields when lying vulnerable in the stillness of night. Rituals also extended into community practices. Villages sometimes rang bells at dusk, not only to signal curfew, but also to ward off evil spirits believed to gather at nightfall. Bonfires were lit during certain festivals, with flames seen as barriers against supernatural forces. In some cultures, whole households recited evening prayers together, turning the act of protection into a shared experience. This collective belief strengthened the bonds within communities, as people felt united not only against physical threats, but against unseen ones as well. Superstitions often blended with practical wisdom. For example, burning incense or herbs at night was believed to drive away spirits, but it also masked smells that might attract animals. Placing sharp objects near doors may have been symbolic protection, but it also discouraged intruders who risked injury. Even garlic, thought to repel vampires in later folklore, had practical antimicrobial properties that protected health. In this way, rituals and superstitions often carried dual benefits, combining psychological comfort with practical outcomes. Imagine lying down to sleep in a medieval cottage. The fire glows faintly, casting long shadows. Before bed, a mother sprinkles a little holy water on the threshold and whispers a prayer. A small iron knife rests on the table nearby, not only for utility, but for protection. A charm carved with a cross hangs over the bed, swaying gently in the smoke. The family settles under rough blankets, reassured not just by the wooden beam across the door, but by the rituals that surround them. To them, these acts are as tangible as walls, a defense against what cannot be seen, but is deeply felt. Though we may no longer whisper the same prayers or hang the same charms, echoes of these practices remain in modern life. Many people still say goodnight prayers, light candles, or keep personal items near their beds for comfort. Nightlights, though practical, also serve a symbolic role. They push back the darkness in the same way ancient lamps once did. The instinct to pair physical defenses with spiritual or symbolic ones remains strong, showing just how deeply rooted the fear of night is in human experience. These rituals remind us that safety is not only about walls and weapons, but also about peace of mind. To fall asleep, people needed to believe they were protected. Rituals and superstitions offered that belief, surrounding them with invisible shields that felt as real as any lock or bar. They gave shape to hope, courage to the fearful, and reassurance to the weary. In a world where darkness was alive with danger, these nightly acts of faith allowed humanity to close its eyes and dream. As human settlements grew larger and more permanent, the responsibility for safety at night expanded beyond individual households. A single family might bar its door, keep a fire glowing, and trust in dogs or charms. But in towns and cities, security became a shared concern. The walls and gates that enclosed communities were not only symbols of civilization, they were lifelines, critical defenses against the dangers of night. In many ways, they were the first collective locks, sealing whole populations within a boundary of protection. The building of walls was one of the earliest hallmarks of urban life. In Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk, often called the world's first true city, was famous for its vast defensive walls. Ancient records claim that these walls stretched miles around the settlement, with monumental gates controlling entry and exit. At sunset, the gates were closed, and with that closing, the city was transformed into a fortress. Within those walls, people slept more securely, knowing that the greatest danger attack from outside had been checked, at least until dawn. Walls were not only barriers of mud brick or stone. They were psychological shields. The knowledge that a physical boundary surrounded the community offered reassurance. To step inside the gates before nightfall was to pass into safety, to leave behind the uncertainty of the open landscape. Travelers arriving late often found themselves locked out, forced to spend the night in the wilderness or at makeshift shelters. The rule was strict. Once the gates closed, no one entered and no one left. The community's safety depended on the boundary being absolute. In Egypt, too, towns and villages often had enclosing walls. These were not always grand structures like those of Mesopotamian cities, but still served the vital function of controlling access. Walls might be made of mud brick baked hard by the sun, and gates reinforced with heavy wooden doors. Soldiers or guards stationed at these entry points made sure the closure at dusk was respected. Once the gates were barred, the settlement could rest, shielded by its boundary. The nightly closing of the gates became as much a ritual as lighting lamps or tending hearths. In medieval Europe, walled towns and cities were a defining feature of the landscape. Stone ramparts encircled markets, churches, and homes, their battlements bristling with watchtowers. The gates were sturdy, often reinforced with iron, and secured with bars and chains at night. Passing through them during the day was simple. Passing through after dark was impossible. The clang of the gates closing was a sound everyone recognized, a signal that the city had entered its protected state. Guards stationed at the gates ensured that no intruders slipped in, and watchmen on the walls scanned the darkness beyond. Life within the walls took on a particular rhythm. At dusk, merchants closed their shops, families hurried home, and travelers sought lodging before the gates shut. The community contracted inward, its energy turning from outward trade to inward safety. Once the gates were locked, the streets grew quieter, the night punctuated only by the calls of watchmen or the barking of dogs. To sleep behind walls was to feel the embrace of the community, to trust that the barrier would hold against whatever prowled in the darkness. The importance of gates extended beyond their physical strength. They were symbols of control. Whoever held the keys or commanded the gatekeepers held authority over the flow of life in the city. In times of war, control of a gate could mean survival or destruction. In times of peace, the gates represented order, separating the chaotic outside world from the ordered life within. For ordinary people, this meant that their sense of safety was tied not just to stone and timber, but also to the discipline of those entrusted with guarding them. In some places, communities layered their defenses with moats, ditches, or additional walls. The city of Constantinople, for example, became legendary for its formidable double walls, which provided such strong protection that the city withstood sieges for centuries. At night, these layers became even more intimidating. A would-be intruder faced not only locked gates, but trenches, drawbridges, and multiple barriers. Within, families could sleep under the protection of engineering marvels that turned whole populations into residents of a fortress. But even in smaller villages, the principle was the same. A simple earthen rampart or wooden palisade could make all the difference. Farmers who lived beyond the walls might bring their animals inside each evening, herding them through the gates before they closed. Children learned early that straying outside after dusk was forbidden, not only for their own safety, but for the safety of the community, which depended on everyone respecting the nightly boundaries. The wall was not just protection. It was discipline, a shared understanding that survival required cooperation. The nightly closing of gates was often accompanied by rituals. In some medieval towns, a bell was rung to signal curfew, warning residents to finish their business and return home. In Japan, temple bells sometimes marked the hours, blending spiritual practice with practical caution. In many cultures, the sound of gates shutting was more than mechanical. It was ceremonial, a transition from the bustle of day to the guarded stillness of night. Still, walls and gates were not invulnerable. History is filled with tales of betrayal, of gates opened by traitors or forced by cunning enemies. For this reason, guards were carefully chosen, and trust in them was paramount. A sleeping community placed its fate in the hands of those who held the keys, relying on their loyalty and vigilance. Even the strongest wall was useless if the gatekeeper faltered. This truth underscored how much safety at night was not just about stone and timber, but about human reliability. Imagine standing at the gate of a medieval town as dusk falls. The heavy wooden doors swing shut, iron bars are slid into place, and chains clink as they tighten. A guard calls out to signal that the gate is secure. Beyond the walls, the fields grow shadowy, the road disappearing into darkness. Inside, lanterns flicker to life, and the murmur of voices fades as people retreat indoors. The gate stands as a silent sentinel, its closure marking the threshold between safety and the unknown. Families go to bed with confidence, not because their own homes are impenetrable, but because the entire community has been locked away together. The tradition of community walls and gates speaks to humanity's instinct for collective security. While households built their own defenses, true safety often came from working together, enclosing not just individuals, but entire populations within protective boundaries. These structures were physical, yes, but they were also psychological. They gave people the courage to close their eyes at night, to trust that they could wake to another day. Though modern cities rarely have walls, the echoes of this practice linger. Gated communities, secured apartment complexes, and neighborhood watches all reflect the same principle. Safety is strongest when it is shared. The walls may now be electronic gates or surveillance cameras, but the idea is unchanged. Just as our ancestors once slept behind city walls, many of us still sleep easier when we know there is a boundary, however symbolic, separating us from the world outside. For most of human history, the choice of where to live carried life or death consequences, especially when night fell. To live within a community meant access to walls, gates, and watchful neighbors. To live alone in the countryside meant exposure, where even the thickest door or fiercest dog could not guarantee safety. This tension between isolation and community shaped not only how people protected themselves at night, but also how entire societies developed. The instinct to cluster together was not simply about trade or companionship. It was about survival in the dark. Rural families who lived outside the shelter of towns faced unique dangers. A farmstead miles from the nearest village could be surrounded by open fields or dense forest, where bandits or predators might roam. At night, the silence around such a home was not reassuring but ominous. Every creak of the wooden beams, every rustle in the trees carried more weight, because there were no neighbors close enough to help if trouble came. A family might bar the door and tend a strong fire, but the knowledge remained that they were alone, their safety resting only on what they could muster themselves. For this reason, many rural households developed layers of defense more elaborate than those in towns. Walls of thorn bushes or tall fences surrounded their land. Dogs were kept in numbers, not just one or two, but sometimes several, creating a living barrier against intrusion. Some families dug ditches or built earthen mounds to discourage raiders. Yet these measures could never match the sense of security that came from living within a community. A lone family was always more vulnerable to surprise, and raiders knew it. By contrast, life inside a village or town offered the strength of numbers. Even if an individual household was poorly defended, the collective safety of clustered homes provided reassurance. Neighbors could hear disturbances, respond to alarms, or lend aid if someone was attacked. The presence of multiple families, each with their own dogs, fires, and watchfulness, created overlapping layers of protection. A thief might slip past one household, but they risked rousing many others. Safety was a communal resource, stronger when shared. This tension between isolation and community shaped human settlement patterns. In regions prone to raids, villages clustered tightly, with homes built close together, sometimes sharing walls. Narrow streets forced strangers to pass within sight of many households, discouraging intrusion. In mountainous or remote areas, where clustering was harder, families often relied on fortified farmhouses or tower houses, buildings designed to withstand attacks long enough for help to arrive. Even then, the ideal was to be within reach of others, for no defense was entirely reliable in solitude. Spiritual and cultural beliefs reinforced the preference for community. Many traditions warned of dangers that targeted the lone sleeper, the spirits, witches or demons that sought out those unprotected by company. To be alone at night was to be exposed not only physically but spiritually. In some cultures, even temporary isolation was avoided. Travelers banded together on the road, forming caravans or groups so they could camp in numbers. Inns and monasteries flourished not only because they provided shelter from the weather, but because they offered this safety of community for those who might otherwise be stranded in the wilderness after dark. Yet isolation also carried its own appeal. Some families chose solitude for independence, for land to farm, or for escape from the crowded conditions of towns. For them, safety required resilience and vigilance. Weapons were kept close, barriers were reinforced, and sleep was light. These households lived with a heightened awareness of risk, their lives shaped by the understanding that help might never arrive if trouble came in the night. Over generations, this bred traditions of self-reliance, passing down not only skills of farming and building, but of defending one's own threshold against danger. The tension between community and isolation is vividly illustrated in historical accounts of raids. Villages often survived because their clustered homes allowed for quick alarms and joint defense. A single farmhouse, however, might be burned or plundered with little resistance. In medieval Europe, this reality gave rise to fortified manors, where lords and peasants alike sought refuge behind stone walls. In Asia, similar patterns emerged, with villages clustering around temples or fortified compounds, ensuring that even in remote regions, safety could be shared. The rhythm of daily life reflected this contrast. In villages, the closing of gates or the ringing of curfew bells marked the shift from day to night, with everyone retreating inside together. In isolated homes, there was no such collective ritual, only the quiet, personal routines of securing doors, checking fires, and listening to the silence outside. The psychological burden was heavier, for solitude magnified every fear. A distant howl of a wolf might send chills through a lone farmer's family, while in a town the same sound, muffled by walls and neighbors, was easier to dismiss. Imagine the difference. In one place, a small family sits in their farmhouse, shutters closed tight, dogs pacing restlessly outside. The night is vast, the fields stretching endlessly, and every sound feels amplified. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by the need to listen, to check, to reassure. In another place, a family in a town lies close together, hearing the faint hum of neighbors settling down, the occasional call of a watchman on the wall, the muffled bark of another household's dog. They know danger exists, but they also know they are not alone in facing it. The comfort of community allows them to rest more deeply. This balance between isolation and community safety influenced not only settlements, but human psychology. To live in community was to share responsibility, to know that others were watching as you slept. To live in isolation was to carry the entire weight yourself, to trust in your own barriers and your own vigilance. Neither choice was free from danger, but they shaped very different experiences of night. Even today, echoes of this divide remain. Rural homes still often rely on dogs, fences, and self-reliance, while urban dwellers trust in the safety of numbers, apartment complexes, and shared security systems. Gated neighborhoods reflect the ancient desire to enclose community within protective boundaries. Solitary cabins or remote farms carry the same vulnerabilities once faced by lone families centuries ago. The tension is timeless, reminding us that safety has always been as much about where we sleep as how we sleep. In the end, the contrast between isolation and community safety reveals something essential about human nature. We are creatures who seek connection, not only for companionship, but for protection. We cluster together against the night, finding courage in numbers. Yet we also cherish independence, even when it carries risk. The story of how people stayed safe at night, before locks, is also the story of how they chose to live with others, or alone, each path carrying its own fears, burdens, and reassurances. When the sun sank and the world grew dark, people turned not only to fire, walls, and watchful neighbors for safety, but also to forces they believed were greater than themselves. Religion, in nearly every culture, offered protection in the hours of vulnerability. To pray before bed, to whisper a blessing, to light a sacred flame, these were not mere rituals of devotion. They were acts of defense, creating invisible shields around the sleeper and calling upon divine guardians to stand watch through the night. For the ancient Mesopotamians, religion and protection were inseparable. Clay tablets preserve long incantations meant to be recited before sleep, invoking gods and spirits to guard the body and soul. The goddess Lama was often called upon as a protective figure, her presence imagined at doorways and windows. Figurines of protective deities, small enough to fit in a hand, were placed around the home, not for decoration, but as living guardians believed to ward off malevolent forces. At night, people trusted that these divine companions stood sentry where human eyes could not. In ancient Egypt, the night was understood as a cosmic struggle. Each evening, the sun god Re journeyed through the underworld, battling the great serpent Apophis, embodiment of chaos. Egyptians mirrored this struggle in their own lives, praying for Ra's victory so that dawn would return. Amulets, often inscribed with protective symbols like the Eye of Horus, were worn during sleep to shield against danger. Rituals might include prayers spoken over children, or protective spells written on papyrus and tucked beneath pillows. For Egyptians, the home itself was a sacred space, where religion infused every act of daily life, including the nightly battle against darkness. The Greeks and Romans also sought divine guardianship at night. Families in Greece often honored Hestia, goddess of the hearth, whose flame was a symbol of both domestic life and protection. In Rome, the household gods, the Lares and Penates, were invoked at bedtime, ensuring their watchful presence. Offerings of food, wine, or incense were given not only out of reverence, but with the expectation of safety in return. Romans sometimes hung charms or bells to repel spirits, blending the physical with the spiritual, but their truest sense of security came from knowing that their gods shared the roof over their heads. In medieval Europe, Christianity shaped nightly rituals of protection. Families crossed themselves before bed, whispered prayers such as the familiar, "Now I lay me down to sleep," and kept crucifixes or images of saints above their beds. Holy water, blessed by priests, might be sprinkled in corners of the room, especially where infants slept. Some even placed small relics or rosaries under pillows. The belief was that angels themselves could be summoned to stand guard, invisible sentinels who would drive away demons, witches, or evil spirits. This faith was not only spiritual comfort, but also practical reassurance. In an age of frequent danger, prayer gave people the courage to surrender to sleep. Other regions carried their own traditions. In India, households lit oil lamps as offerings to deities, keeping them burning through the night to ward off both spirits and misfortune. In China, Taoist rituals sometimes called upon protective spirits, while Buddhist households recited mantras before bed, surrounding the mind with peaceful energy. In Japan, charms inscribed with prayers known as ofuda were placed at entrances to repel evil. Across cultures, the act of aligning oneself with the divine at night was nearly universal, reflecting the shared understanding that darkness held more than physical threats. Religious rituals often extended beyond the household to entire communities. In medieval towns, church bells rang at dusk, marking curfew, but also symbolically driving away evil. Monasteries chanted evening prayers, the sound carrying across villages as a reminder that the sacred vigil continued even as ordinary people slept. In some cities, temple fires were kept burning all night, visible beacons of divine guardianship that reassured those within the walls. These public displays were as much about safety as devotion, reinforcing the idea that communities rested not only under human watch, but under divine care. The role of religion in night safety was not only about protection from danger, it was about peace of mind. To fall asleep required trust, and religion provided that trust. A whispered prayer created the sense that one was not alone, that higher powers watched over the vulnerable body. Parents felt comfort placing their children under the care of angels or deities. believing that the divine shield was stronger than any wall. Even if the night was restless, the presence of faith smoothed the edges of fear, allowing rest to come more easily. Religion also gave meaning to fear. In a world where natural sounds and events were mysterious, faith offered explanations. A sudden illness at night might be blamed on evil spirits, but the cure was prayer or blessing. A bad dream could be interpreted as a spiritual warning, and rituals might be performed to counter it. Rather than feeling helpless, people could act lighting candles, making signs, whispering charms actions that gave them agency against the unknown. Faith transformed fear into ritual, and ritual into reassurance. Imagine a medieval family preparing for bed. The father checks the door beam. The mother sprinkles holy water near the cradle, and the children kneel briefly to say their prayers. A small candle burns before a cross on the wall, its flame flickering gently. Outside, the town gates are shut, and watchmen patrol the streets. But within the house, the family places its deepest trust in invisible guardians. They close their eyes believing angels will stand watch, their prayers forming a shield as tangible to them as stone walls. The ritual is not simply habit. It is survival, a way of confronting the night with hope. Even in our modern world, echoes of these practices remain. Many people still say evening prayers, keep symbolic items near their beds, or light candles before sleeping. Rituals of faith continue to offer comfort, reminding us that the desire for spiritual guardianship is timeless. While locks, alarms, and security systems now serve as our physical defenses, religion still fills the deeper need for peace of mind, assuring us that we are protected in ways no wall or machine can provide. The role of religion in night safety shows us how deeply intertwined survival and belief have always been. People did not simply pray for the sake of tradition. They prayed because they felt it made the difference between vulnerability and safety. Faith was the invisible lock on the door, the unseen guard at the threshold, the silent companion in the dark. In turning to the divine, humanity found the courage to close its eyes in a dangerous world, trusting that dawn would come again. Long before the invention of keys and sophisticated locks, people devised clever ways to secure their doors and chests with simple mechanisms. These early barriers were not locks in the modern sense, but they performed the same function, slowing intruders, creating obstacles, and reassuring families that their homes were not entirely vulnerable. They relied on wood, stone, or metal, and on the ingenuity of ordinary people who knew that even the smallest delay could make the difference between danger and safety. The simplest form of mechanical defense was the wooden bar. A heavy beam could be slid across the inside of a door, resting in grooves carved into the wall. When the bar was in place, the door could not be opened from the outside without immense force. This method was common across cultures, from ancient Mesopotamian houses to medieval cottages. The sound of the bar being dropped into place became a nightly ritual, a moment when a family symbolically shut out the world. It was not a lock in the technical sense, but it offered a sense of finality, a line between inside and outside that few intruders could cross quietly. Sliding bolts and latches added another layer of ingenuity. A wooden latch could drop into a slot to hold a door closed, and sometimes these were attached to cords that could be pulled from the inside. In some places, clever designs allowed a door to be opened only by reaching through a small hole or window, making it more difficult for outsiders to manipulate. These mechanisms relied on simplicity, but they were effective enough to keep out casual trespassers. Windows, though often small and high, were sometimes secured with shutters fastened by simple wooden pins or crossbars. Even these little touches made households feel safer, for they eliminated the chance of an intruder slipping quietly inside. In wealthier homes, metal fittings began to appear, with iron bars reinforcing doors and shutters. These were expensive, but they signaled both strength and status, showing that a family valued security enough to invest in lasting protection. Chests and storage containers, too, were secured with primitive mechanisms. Families stored food, tools, or valuables in wooden boxes fitted with sliding pins or simple hasps. These early fastenings were designed less to withstand determined thieves than to discourage opportunistic ones. A sealed chest suggested ownership, making it clear that whatever lay inside was protected. Just as with doors, the act of fastening a chest at night carried symbolic weight, turning the ordinary container into something guarded. In larger buildings or fortifications, mechanical barriers became more complex. Castle gates, for instance, often used drawbars' massive beams that slid into sockets, holding the gates firmly in place. Portcullises, heavy grills that could be raised or lowered, added another mechanical layer designed to trap intruders before they could breach the inner defenses. Though far grander than a peasant's door bar, these mechanisms were built on the same principle: block the opening, delay the intruder, and create time for defenders to respond. One of the earliest true locks, however, came from ancient Egypt. These were large wooden devices with movable pins that could be lifted using a specially shaped key. While rare and costly, they represented a new way of thinking about security, a mechanism that allowed entry only to those with the correct tool. Even so, for most people, such locks were far beyond reach. Instead, they continued to rely on bars, latches, and bolts, which required no keys and could be fashioned from local materials. The psychological importance of these mechanisms cannot be overstated. To slide a bolt into place or drop a bar across a door gave a family peace of mind. It was a physical gesture of safety, a way of saying, "We have done what we can, and now we may rest." Even if determined intruders could still force their way in, the effort required made such attempts riskier. The noise of breaking wood or struggling with bolts might alert the household or neighbors, giving them a chance to respond. Different cultures developed variations suited to their environments. In rural Europe, doors were often reinforced with diagonal bracing, making them harder to force open. In China, wooden doors were sometimes fitted with sliding beams secured by carved brackets, creating elegant yet sturdy barriers. In desert regions where wood was scarce, doors might be reinforced with woven reeds or ropes tied in complex knots, difficult for strangers to untangle in the dark. The creativity of these designs reflected both necessity and resourcefulness. Households sometimes added layers of trickery to their defenses. Strings or cords were tied to bolts in ways that allowed them to be manipulated from inside without opening the door fully. Some people hung small objects from latches, which would fall noisily if tampered with. Others created false fastenings, designed to confuse intruders who might waste precious time struggling with them. Even without metal keys, families found ways to make entry unpredictable, turning simplicity into strategy. Imagine a family in a medieval cottage at night. The fire has burned low, the children are gathered under rough blankets, and the father takes the final step of sliding the door bar into its grooves. The sound is heavy, solid, reassuring. Outside, the night presses close, but inside, the family feels enclosed by more than just walls. The bar across the door is more than wood. It is a promise of safety, a declaration that the household is secure. The mother fastens a shutter with a peg, checks a chest where valuables are stored, and then the room grows quiet. The simple mechanics of wood and beam have transformed a vulnerable home into a guarded space. Over time, these early barriers laid the groundwork for the true locks that would follow. They taught people that mechanical solutions could create powerful psychological effects, offering reassurance even when danger remained. A beam across a door was not unbreakable, but it was enough to give courage. A latch was not impenetrable, but it provided the comfort of resistance. These inventions were the first steps on a path that would eventually lead to the locks and keys we take for granted today. Even now, echoes of these early practices remain. Many doors still use bolts and latches alongside modern locks, their simple mechanics unchanged for centuries. The act of turning a deadbolt or sliding a chain across a door feels reassuring in the same way it once did to our ancestors. We may have refined the materials and improved the mechanisms, but the principle is the same. Control the entry point, and rest easier knowing a barrier stands between us and the unknown. The story of early mechanical barriers reminds us that safety is often about perception as much as reality. A bar across a door might not stop every intruder, but it gave families the confidence to sleep. That confidence was as important as the barrier itself, for without it, fear would never have allowed rest. In the centuries before true locks became common, these simple devices, beams, bolts, latches, and pegs were the unsung guardians of the night. In the silence of night, every sound seemed amplified. The creak of a door hinge, the crack of a twig, the shuffle of unseen feet, all could rouse fear or suspicion. But in this same silence lay an opportunity. Long before locks, people realized that noise itself could act as a guardian, startling intruders and alerting sleepers to danger. By turning sound into a tool, families and communities created early warning systems that required no keys, no costly materials, only the clever use of sound to make the night less uncertain. One of the simplest methods was to hang objects near doors or windows that would rattle if disturbed. Pots, shells, bones, or bells could be strung together on cords, clattering loudly at the slightest movement. In rural households, these might be hung from shutters or across thresholds, ready to jingle if a thief tried to push his way in. For families who lived without guards or walls, such noisy charms offered reassurance. They were the ancestors of today's door chimes and alarms, rooted in the simple idea that noise exposes stealth. In parts of Asia, households often hung wind chimes not only for beauty or spiritual protection, but also as practical deterrence. The soft sound of chimes in the breeze was familiar, but the sudden, harsh jangle of a forced movement could be unmistakable. Suspicious noises were often enough to wake even the heaviest sleeper, especially when people slept lightly in anticipation of danger. Over time, these objects gained symbolic power, believed to ward off spirits as well as thieves. A tinkling chime became both an alarm and a charm, part of the layered defenses of a household. In medieval Europe, some families used crude tripwires, stretching cords across doorways with small bells or metal pieces attached. If someone stumbled against the wire in the dark, the resulting clatter echoed through the room, waking the household. Even in towns with walls and watchmen, such household precautions were common, for danger could come not only from outside, but from within a quarrel, a thief, or even a restless drunk returning home at night. The sound of a bell or a pot crashing to the ground gave precious seconds to rouse and respond. Communities, too, recognized the power of noise. In towns and cities, bells rang at curfew, warning residents that the gates were closing. Once night fell, watchmen patrolled the streets, deliberately making noise to signal their presence. In some places, they struck staffs against the cobblestones or called out the hours. This practice served two purposes. It reassured citizens that the watch was awake, and it discouraged wrongdoers who knew they could not act unnoticed. The deliberate use of noise turned the silence of night into a shared signal of vigilance. Military camps took this principle further. Guards often carried rattles, drums, or horns to raise alarm quickly. A sudden noise could wake an entire camp within moments, transforming sleeping soldiers into defenders. Fires might light the perimeter, but sound carried faster than flame. Even small noises, like the bark of a dog or the startled bray of a donkey, could spread through a camp like a ripple, ensuring that no threat passed silently. For armies, noise was not only a weapon, but a lifeline. Animals themselves were integral to this system of sound. A goose's honk, a dog's bark, a horse's whinny all became natural alarms. But even beyond animals, People engineered ways to use the environment as a noisy guardian. Loose stones scattered on paths made it impossible for someone to approach without crunching underfoot. Gravel or dry leaves around thresholds crackled loudly, exposing intruders in the dark. Families intentionally left such noisy surfaces in place, turning the land itself into an alarm. Some households went further, setting traps designed to make noise rather than cause harm. A jar balanced precariously on a shelf near a door, a board rigged to fall if pushed. These simple devices startled trespassers and alerted sleepers. Unlike lethal traps, which were risky and dangerous even for the household itself, noise-making traps were safe but effective. The sudden crash of pottery or the bang of wood hitting the floor was often enough to send an intruder fleeing before anyone even stirred. The psychological effect of noise was as important as its practical one. For the household, knowing that an unexpected sound would betray an intruder gave peace of mind, making it easier to sleep. For the intruder, the risk of noise created hesitation. Silence was a thief's greatest ally, and anything that threatened to shatter it was a powerful deterrent. The possibility of being discovered, even by the smallest rattle of a shell or bell, often dissuaded would-be trespassers from trying at all. Religious and cultural traditions reinforced this practice. In some cultures, bells or rattles were believed not only to warn of danger, but also to drive away spirits. The idea that evil could not withstand sound was common across the world. Priests in temples rang bells during evening rituals, ensuring that spirits would not linger. Families imitated this on a smaller scale, hanging bells by doors or carrying rattles in the night. The line between spiritual protection and practical alarm blurred, creating defenses that operated on both levels at once. Imagine a family settling into their home in the countryside. The father ties a string of shells across the doorway, their smooth surfaces clicking gently when touched. The mother sets a pot near the window, balanced so that even the smallest push will topple it. Outside, the dog lies watchful, ears pricked for sound. In the silence of night, the smallest disturbance would erupt into noise, waking the sleepers and sending fear into the heart of any intruder. The family does not expect perfect safety, but they sleep with reassurance, knowing they will not be taken by surprise. Over time, the principle of noise as deterrent became refined into more sophisticated devices. In the Islamic world, water clocks and mechanical devices were sometimes adapted to strike bells at intervals, blending timekeeping with reassurance. In medieval Europe, clappers and rattles were used by watchmen not only to mark their patrols, but also to signal danger. The idea of creating controlled sound as a way to deter crime gradually evolved into early alarm systems, precursors to the technologies we know today. Yet at its core, the idea remains simple. Noise interrupts stealth. It breaks the silence intruders rely upon, and it rouses sleepers from vulnerability. Even today, echoes of these ancient practices remain. Door chimes, motion-sensitive alarms, barking dogs, and even gravel driveways all serve the same purpose as the pots, shells, and bells of centuries past. They remind us that sound, as much as walls or locks, has always been one of humanity's greatest allies in facing the dangers of the night. The use of noise as deterrent reveals something fundamental about human creativity. With little more than everyday objects, people found ways to harness the environment against danger. A clatter in the night might not stop an intruder entirely, but it bought time, spread alarm, and gave courage to those who slept. Long before locks, noise itself was the unseen guard, echoing through the darkness, ensuring that silence never became the thief's greatest weapon. For all the rituals, barriers, and watchful animals, there remained one final line of defense: the weapons kept within reach at night. In a world before locks, when danger might force its way past walls, fires, and charms, people relied on blades, clubs, or bows lying close at hand. These weapons were not symbols of aggression so much as tokens of survival, quiet companions that reassured sleepers they would not be helpless if woken suddenly in the dark. In the simplest households, the weapon was little more than a sturdy stick kept by the door or near the bed. Farmers who used tools by day often relied on those same tools as weapons by night. A hoe or a hatchet, laid within reach, was as much a guardian as the dog curled at the threshold. To sleep beside such objects was a practical habit, born of the knowledge that speed mattered most when danger arrived. In the dark, there was no time to search or prepare. The weapon had to be ready, as much a part of the sleeping space as blankets or straw. In many cultures, spears were the favored choice. Long enough to keep distance from an attacker and simple to use, a spear leaned against the wall or laid across the bed gave reassurance to families vulnerable in their sleep. Warriors, hunters, and common laborers alike trusted the familiarity of the spear. In medieval Europe, peasants often kept pikes or staves nearby, while in Africa and Asia, spears remained the universal tool of both hunting and defense. To grip a spear in the darkness was to feel that one was not entirely powerless, even if startled awake. Knives and short blades were also common. Many households kept them under pillows or beside sleeping mats. In ancient Rome, men sometimes slept with daggers close by, believing that even the smallest blade was better than bare hands in a sudden struggle. In Japan, samurai famously rested with swords within arm's reach, their discipline extending even into their hours of rest. The blade beside the bed was not simply a weapon, it was an extension of responsibility, a promise that one would defend family and home even in the most vulnerable state. In frontier or rural regions, bows and arrows were often prepared before bed, arrows already notched or laid in bundles within reach. Though less useful in cramped interiors, bows were valuable for households that might need to fire from a window or rooftop at approaching raiders. A quiver within arm's reach gave reassurance that danger could be met at a distance, buying time for others to flee or prepare. In every case, the weapon at hand was chosen not for elegance, but for immediacy. What mattered was readiness. The presence of weapons in sleeping spaces also reflected the reality of fear. To live in constant readiness carried a weight of anxiety. A family that felt compelled to keep blades beside their beds did not do so lightly. It was a burden, a reminder that safety could never be taken for granted. Yet this same burden was balanced by comfort. To reach out in the night and feel the smooth wood of a staff or the cold metal of a blade was to feel less helpless, to know that even if danger came, one could stand and fight. In military camps, sleeping with weapons was not optional, but required. Soldiers kept their swords, shields, or spears beside them, ready to leap into action at a moment's notice. Roman legionaries, for instance, were drilled to sleep lightly, with their gear arranged in precise order so they could rise and arm themselves quickly. In nomadic armies of the steppe, warriors often kept bows strung in horses tethered nearby, ready for instant movement. The line between sleep and battle was thin, and weapons blurred it further, making rest a fragile but necessary pause. Even in peacetime, echoes of this military discipline appeared in ordinary life. In medieval villages prone to raids, men often slept with weapons close, and families drilled simple routines. Who would grab the children? Who would light the fire? Who would carry the club or spear? The weapon at hand was not only a tool, but part of a plan, woven into nightly life as naturally as closing the door or stoking the embers. Religious and cultural beliefs sometimes sanctified this practice. In some traditions, weapons kept near the bed were blessed or marked with protective symbols, making them both physical and spiritual guardians. In India, swords and knives were sometimes consecrated during festivals, then kept in households as sacred protectors. In Europe, knights often saw their swords as bearing divine duty, and to rest with them nearby was to rest under God's protection as well. The weapon thus became more than wood or steel. It became a trusted companion, infused with meaning. The practice of keeping weapons at hand shaped the very way people slept. Many learned to rest lightly, attuned to sound, able to rouse quickly if needed. Sleep was not always deep or peaceful. It was a balance between rest and readiness. Families arranged themselves so that those strongest or most experienced in fighting lay nearest the doors or walls, ready to intercept danger. Children were placed in the middle, surrounded by adults armed and alert. In this way, even in slumber, the household was arranged like a fortress. Imagine a small cottage on the edge of a forest. The fire has burned to glowing embers, the door is barred, and a family settles into sleep. Beside the father lies a stout staff, worn from years of work in the fields. The mother has a knife tucked near her place, ready if needed. Outside, the dog stirs at every sound. The night is filled with possibility, but inside there is preparedness. Sleep comes not because danger is gone, but because defenses are at hand. The weapons are silent companions, their presence enough to give courage. Over centuries, as locks became more common and communities more secure, the need to sleep with weapons declined, yet the instinct has never vanished entirely. Many still keep protective objects near their beds, whether for practical defense or for peace of mind. The idea that one should not be caught helpless in sleep remains deeply ingrained, a reminder of older times when the only barrier between vulnerability and survival was the weapon at one's side. The story of sleeping with weapons at hand reveals the rawness of human life before modern security. It speaks of fear, but also of resilience, of families who balanced rest with vigilance, who found ways to survive even when danger was never far away. Weapons by the bed were not signs of violence, but of determination. The determination to protect, to endure, and to see another dawn. Of all the concerns that weighed upon families when darkness fell, none loomed larger than the safety of children. Adults might accept the risk of danger, even prepare themselves with weapons and vigilance. But children represented innocence and fragility. They were less able to protect themselves, less able to wake quickly, less aware of what the night might conceal. To keep children safe was the deepest instinct, shaping how households arranged their sleeping spaces, performed rituals, and guarded their doors. In many ways, the history of night safety before locks is the story of parents' tireless efforts to shield their young from the vulnerabilities of sleep. In small homes, children rarely slept apart from their parents. Instead, they were placed close, often in the very center of the family bed or on mats beside their mothers. This arrangement was more than a matter of comfort. It was strategy. By surrounding children with adults, families created a living shield. Any danger, be it a thief, a predator, or even a fire, would first confront the parents, giving them a chance to respond before harm reached the young. This layering of bodies reflected the same principle used in fortresses and camps: protect the weakest by placing them in the middle. Nighttime rituals often focused especially on children. Parents whispered prayers or charms over cradles, hung amulets above infants, or drew protective symbols near where they slept. In medieval Europe, mothers sprinkled holy water on a child's bed, trusting in divine guardianship. In Egypt, small charms carved with the eye of Horus or scarab beetles were tied to children's clothing. In Mesopotamia, figurines of protective spirits were buried beneath doorways or placed in corners of rooms where children slept. These acts gave parents reassurance, as though the invisible world itself had been enlisted to guard their children. Lullabies, too, carried protective weight. Songs sung to soothe children often contained blessings or invocations hidden within their simple words. A mother's voice, soft and steady, wrapped the child not only in comfort but in protection. The rhythm of song was believed to guard against nightmares, to create a safe passage into sleep. In many cultures, lullabies were less about melody than about ritual, a way of weaving safety through sound. Cradles and sleeping spaces were designed with defense in mind. Some cradles were hung from beams or branches, rocking gently out of reach of animals that might wander inside. Others were built with hoods or covers, protecting infants from drafts, insects, or prying eyes. In rural homes, where animals sometimes shared living space, cradles were carefully placed to keep children out of harm's way, while still within sight of parents. The physical design of these spaces reflected the constant awareness of vulnerability. Older children, though more independent, were still considered at risk. They were often placed beside siblings or in groups, never left to sleep alone. In villages, groups of children might share lofts or sleeping platforms, their closeness both practical and protective. Parents believed that if one child woke in fear or at the sound of danger, the others would stir too, spreading awareness like ripples across water. Sleep was thus communal, even for the young, an echo of the larger community's reliance on shared vigilance. Stories and beliefs reinforced the special vulnerability of children at night. In Europe, tales of witches or spirits seeking unbaptized infants gave urgency to nightly rituals. In other regions, stories warned of demons that preyed upon children's dreams. These beliefs, while frightening, served a practical purpose. They encouraged parents to remain attentive, to perform protective acts consistently. Fear for children became a driving force behind the rituals that guarded entire households. Travel brought additional risks. Families on the move were especially careful to secure their children at night. Infants might be wrapped and tied close to mothers, while older children were kept within the innermost circle of sleeping mats. In caravans or camps, children were placed at the very center, surrounded by adults who formed a living wall. Fires and guard animals might stand at the perimeter, but it was the arrangement of bodies around children that offered the deepest reassurance. The vulnerability of children also influenced the broader structure of communities. Villages built walls not only for crops or animals, but for the young, who represented the future. Gates closed at night were symbolic locks, not just for goods, but for the generations growing within. Entire communities understood that to protect children was to ensure survival, and so nightly safety measures often emphasized their well-being above all. Yet, despite every precaution, danger could still reach the young. Illness, accidents, or raids sometimes claimed lives, leaving behind grief that reinforced the urgency of protection. Each loss deepened the community's resolve to guard more carefully, to refine rituals, to strengthen barriers. The memory of vulnerability became tradition, shaping practices passed down through generations. Imagine a small family in a medieval village. The parents settle their children on a bed of straw in the middle of the single-room cottage. The father slides the door beam into place, while the mother sprinkles water, blessed by a priest, over the cradle. A lullaby is sung, the rhythm soothing not only the children, but the weary parents themselves. Outside, the night is restless, with dogs barking and watchmen calling faintly from the walls. Inside, the children breathe softly, their sleep protected by the layered care of family, ritual, and community. Even today, echoes of these practices remain. Parents still watch closely over their children at night, listening for cries, checking doors and windows, leaving small lights glowing in the darkness. Modern technology, baby monitors, alarms, secure locks, serves the same purpose once achieved by charms, dogs, and careful arrangements. The instinct is unchanged, to guard the most vulnerable while they sleep. The history of keeping children safe at night shows how deeply love and fear intertwined in the ancient world. Parents could not banish every danger, but they could create layers of protection, physical, spiritual, emotional, that gave them strength to rest. In doing so, they not only shielded their children, but shaped traditions that endured across centuries. The vulnerability of the young was a constant reminder that safety at night was never just about survival in the present. It was about securing the future. For much of history, night was not a time to be on the road. Darkness brought with it a host of dangerous bandits lurking in shadows. wild animals prowling unseen, and the ever-present risk of losing one's way when paths disappeared into blackness. To travel after sunset was to step into uncertainty, and most people avoided it whenever possible. But there were times when journeys could not be delayed. A merchant pressed by trade, a pilgrim seeking refuge, a messenger carrying urgent news. For such travelers, the central concern was always the same: where to find shelter before the full weight of night descended. The first line of safety for travelers was the roadside inn. These establishments, though humble, offered more than food and rest. They provided protection. An inn meant walls, a barred door, perhaps a fire in the common room, and most importantly, the presence of others. A lone traveler might be vulnerable, but in the company of fellow guests, guarded by innkeepers who valued their reputation, safety increased. In Roman times, roadside inns known as mansiones or coponi dotted the great roads of the empire, giving merchants and officials places to rest securely. Though not always comfortable or clean, they provided the crucial assurance that night would pass within walls rather than under the open sky. Monasteries and temples also served as sanctuaries for travelers. In medieval Europe, abbeys opened their gates to pilgrims and wanderers, offering food, bedding, and the safety of sacred ground. Travelers who reached such places before nightfall found themselves within walls, protected not only by stone, but by the weight of divine authority. In Asia, Buddhist monasteries welcomed those seeking rest, while in the Middle East, caravanserais' large enclosed courtyards, with rooms for merchants and their animals, provided protection along trade routes. These places were more than accommodations. They were havens against the perils of darkness. For those who found themselves caught between destinations at nightfall, improvisation was essential. Travelers often banded together, forming temporary camps along roadsides. Fires were lit, animals tethered close, and sleeping mats arranged in circles for mutual protection. The practice of clustering together reflected the same principle found in villages: safety in numbers. A thief might prey on one traveler, but a group could defend itself, or at least sound an alarm. The glow of multiple fires and the noise of many voices deterred attackers, turning vulnerability into collective strength. Yet even in groups, traveling at night carried heavy risks. Roads were often narrow, winding, and poorly marked. Without light, it was easy to stumble into ditches, lose one's way, or encounter hazards unseen. Bridges might be treacherous in darkness, and rivers impossible to cross safely. Bandits favored night, knowing they could ambush travelers more easily under cover of shadows. For many, the thought of being stranded in the open, away from gates or walls, was enough to instill dread. The urgency to find shelter before nightfall became a rhythm of travel, shaping how far people could realistically journey in a day. Stories and folklore captured these dangers vividly. Tales warned of spirits or demons that haunted crossroads at night, reflecting the real risks of being lost or attacked. Travelers who ignored the wisdom of resting before sundown were often portrayed as reckless or doomed. Such tales reinforced cultural lessons. Do not linger on the road after dark. Seek the safety of an inn, a monastery, or a village gate. Even when danger was not supernatural, the stories captured the truth that night travel was a gamble few could afford. For the poor, however, options were limited. Inns cost money, and monasteries might not always open their doors. Many slept in barns, caves, or roadside shelters. A farmer's generosity, a hayloft offered by a villager, or even the cover of a ruined building could mean the difference between safety and peril. These makeshift shelters were not secure, but they provided cover from the elements and at least a semblance of protection. In such cases, travelers relied heavily on animals for warning dogs, donkeys, or even horses, whose sudden agitation might reveal threats in the night. Caravan travel offered a unique form of safety. Along the great trade routes of Asia and the Middle East, merchants traveled in large groups with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of companions. At night, the caravan formed enclosed camps, wagons or animals, arranged in protective circles. Fires burned at the edges, guards kept watch, and the collective presence deterred most bandits. The caravanserai, those fortified inns along the Silk Road, became essential, offering sturdy walls where merchants could sleep while their goods and animals were secured in the courtyards. For travelers carrying wealth, these places were lifelines. The anxiety of being stranded outside community walls at dusk was universal. In medieval Europe, a traveler who reached a walled town too late often begged at the gates, hoping the watchman might let them in. Sometimes, out of pity or for a bribe, entry was granted. More often, the gates remained shut, and the traveler was left to find whatever shelter they could in the fields or woods. To sleep outside the walls was to lie exposed, relying on fire, dogs, and hope. Many tales of danger began with just such a scene. The unlucky soul left outside, listening to the heavy thud of the gates closing behind them. Imagine such a traveler, a merchant, weary from the road, arriving too late at a city gate. The sun has set, and the watchman shakes his head. The gates close with a final clang, leaving the merchant outside. He finds a small grove by the road, lights a fire, and ties his donkey nearby. He eats a little bread in silence, the night thick around him. Every crack of a twig makes him look up. Every rustle in the brush quickens his heart. He clutches a staff as he lies down, knowing that sleep may come only lightly, and that dawn cannot arrive soon enough. Even today, remnants of these anxieties remain. We may not fear wolves or bandits, but travelers still seek safe rest stops, lit highways, or the security of hotels. The instinct to find shelter before nightfall endures. Modern roads, inns, and guest houses are descendants of those ancient caravanserais and monasteries, places where weary people sought not just rest but protection. The need is timeless. When darkness falls, humans look for walls, doors, and the presence of others to guard them through the night. The history of traveling at night and seeking shelter reveals a simple truth. Safety was rarely found in motion, but in stopping finding walls, fires, or companions to share the vulnerable hours until dawn. Locks were rare or non-existent, but the rhythms of travel and the sanctuaries of inns and temples provided what was most needed: the reassurance that one could sleep without fear of being overtaken by the darkness. Though the fear of night was universal, the ways people sought safety after sunset varied widely across the world. Geography, climate, religion, and tradition all shaped how different cultures prepared for darkness. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the forests of Europe, from the great cities of China to the villages of Africa, people devised their own methods to guard against the unknown. The practices differed in form, yet all reflected the same instinct: to survive the night and greet the morning in peace. In Mesopotamia, where some of the first cities rose from the fertile plains, night safety centered on walls and rituals. Massive city walls enclosed populations, with gates sealed at dusk to keep out raiders. Within homes of mud brick, families relied on beams to bar their doors and on charms to ward off spirits. Clay tablets preserved spells meant to protect sleepers from demons, while figurines of protective gods were placed at thresholds. The combination of physical barriers and spiritual safeguards reveals how Mesopotamians viewed night as a threat both human and supernatural. In ancient Egypt, where the Nile shaped daily life, the night was seen as a cosmic struggle. Just as the sun god Re fought the serpent Apophis in the underworld each evening, households performed their own protective acts. Amulets inscribed with symbols like the eye of Horus guarded sleepers, while small lamps were kept burning to hold back darkness. Egyptian homes often had narrow, easily secured entrances, reflecting both the heat of the climate and the need for security. The nightly cycle of danger and renewal was deeply tied to religion, and protection was as much about aligning with cosmic order as about defending against thieves. In Greece and Rome, household gods took central roles in protection. Greek families invoked Hestia, goddess of the hearth, while Romans made offerings to their Lares and Penates. Practical measures were combined with spiritual ones, bars across doors, dogs stationed at thresholds, and charms hung near beds. Urban settings also relied on organized watchmen. In Rome, the vigils patrolled at night, protecting against both crime and fire. The sense of safety came not only from personal precautions, but from the structured vigilance of the state, a mark of how urban life demanded communal defenses. In medieval Europe, safety at night depended heavily on walls, gates, and faith. Walled towns closed their gates firmly at dusk, and watchmen patrolled with torches, calling out the hours. Inside homes, families slept close together, with beams across doors and small weapons nearby. Crosses were carved into doors, holy water sprinkled near cradles, and prayers whispered before bed. The mingling of practical defenses with Christian rituals reflected a worldview in which both bandits and demons were threats. Even villages without walls clustered homes tightly, relying on closeness, dogs, and shared vigilance. In China, traditions blended practicality with ritual in unique ways. Families often hung charms and paper talismans over doors, inscribed with protective blessings. Night watchmen patrolled cities with clappers or gongs, striking the hours to reassure citizens that vigilance continued. In rural areas, houses were sometimes built on raised platforms, with ladders pulled up at night to block entry. Fires burned at entrances, both for warmth and for protection. The rhythm of safety was tied to Confucian ideals of order, with households and communities working in harmony to ensure collective security. In Japan, Shinto and Buddhist traditions shaped night safety. Amulets called omamori were kept in homes, offering divine protection, while temple bells rang out in the evening, marking the passage into night. Rural houses often used sliding wooden doors, reinforced with bars, while villages relied on collective watchfulness. Folklore warned of yokai spirits that roamed in darkness, and families responded with charms, prayers, and lamps. The boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were seen as especially thin at night, so safety required both vigilance and reverence. Across Africa, practices varied with environment, but often emphasized the role of animals and community. In pastoral societies, dogs and large guardian animals like donkeys played vital roles in protecting households and livestock. Villages were clustered, sometimes surrounded by thorn fences or walls of stone. Fires burned at night to deter predators, while songs, chants, or drumming were believed to drive away spirits. In many places, the line between practical defense and spiritual ritual blurred, creating layered systems of protection suited to the landscape. In the Americas, indigenous communities also developed diverse practices. In the Andes, highland villages built stone walls and relied on watchmen to guard at night. In North America, many tribes organized sleeping arrangements in circles, with fires at the center and warriors on the outer edge. Rituals, songs, and protective charms were used widely, reflecting a belief that dreams and spirits were deeply intertwined with night safety. The practices were adapted to environment forests, plains, or mountains, but always carried the same goal: survival through the long hours of darkness. The Middle East, with its deserts and caravan routes, relied heavily on group travel and fortified shelters. Caravanserais offered enclosed protection for merchants, while nomadic groups arranged tents in defensive circles, with fires and guards along the perimeter. Religious practices reciting verses from the Koran, invoking God's protection, were integral to nightly safety. Here, the combination of faith, architecture, and communal vigilance created strong defenses against both human and natural threats. Though the details varied, common threads emerge. Almost everywhere, families slept close together, reinforcing safety through proximity. Fire was nearly universal as a guardian, both for light and for defense. Dogs or other animals played vital roles as alarms. Rituals, charms, and prayers were present across cultures, reflecting the belief that unseen forces were as dangerous as seen ones. And in all places, communities understood that gates, walls, or circles of tents gave more security than solitude. Imagine the contrast. In Mesopotamia, a family recites spells by firelight, trusting in gods and doorbeams. In China, a watchman strikes his gong, the sound carrying reassurance through the streets. In Europe, a bell tolls curfew, gates close, and families whisper prayers. In Africa, dogs bark at the perimeter of a thorn fence, while a fire burns steadily against the night. Though separated by oceans and centuries, each family shares the same quiet hope that morning will come, that they will see the light again, that the dark will pass safely. These cultural differences remind us that while the details of safety varied, the human condition did not. Across the world, people faced the same vulnerability: sleep. They responded with creativity, drawing on what their environment and beliefs offered. The walls of Uruk, the charms of Egypt, the crosses of Europe, the talismans of China, all were answers to the same question: how do we rest in a world where night makes us defenseless? Today, modern locks and alarms obscure these differences, but the instincts remain. We still draw comfort from barriers, from ritual gestures before bed, from the presence of family or companions nearby. The echoes of those ancient practices live on in habits that may seem simple, but carry the weight of millennia. The story of cultural differences in night safety is not one of separation, but of shared humanity, different answers to the same timeless fear. For thousands of years, people relied on fire, walls, watchmen, animals, and rituals to guard them through the night. But eventually, a new invention began to change the way humans thought about safety: the lock. At first rare, costly, and complex, locks slowly transformed from luxuries of the wealthy into everyday tools that reshaped the meaning of privacy and protection. The story of this transition reveals not only the ingenuity of human hands, but also the deep yearning for security that had always defined the struggle against darkness. The earliest known locks date back to ancient Egypt, around 4,000 years ago. These devices were large, wooden mechanisms built into doors, using movable pins that could be lifted with a specially shaped key. The principle was remarkably similar to pin tumbler locks still used today, though far simpler in design. For the Egyptians who possessed them, locks were more than practical. They were symbols of status. To own a lock meant not only that one could secure their household, but that they had wealth enough to afford such craftsmanship. The key itself, often large and heavy, was carried as a sign of authority. From Egypt, the concept of locks spread to Mesopotamia and beyond. Archaeological evidence shows that Assyrian and Babylonian households also used wooden locks with sliding bolts and pins. These devices offered more than a barred door could. They prevented entry not just by force, but by ignorance. Without the correct key, an intruder could not easily manipulate the pins. For the first time, protection was no longer only about strength or vigilance. It was about knowledge and possession. To have the key was to hold the power of entry. In Rome, locks advanced further. Roman smiths developed metal locks and keys more durable and intricate than their wooden predecessors. Keys became smaller, often made of bronze or iron, and some were fashioned as rings worn on the fingers. To carry a key on one's person was both practical and symbolic, signaling ownership and control. Wealthy Romans locked chests, doors, and storerooms, securing valuables with technology rather than with guards alone. Though not all households could afford such devices, their spread marked a turning point. Security was no longer purely communal, but increasingly individual. Still, for centuries, locks remained rare outside the wealthy. Most common families continued to rely on beams, bars, and animals. Locks required skilled craftsmanship and costly materials, making them inaccessible to peasants and farmers. The presence of a lock on a home or chest was a marker of status as much as of security. Yet the idea of the lock gradually filtered into wider society, carried by trade, conquest, and imitation. Over time, locksmiths became established tradesmen, their skills in demand by nobles, merchants, and towns. By the medieval period in Europe, locks had become more widespread, though still far from universal. Castles and manors used large iron locks on gates, doors, and treasure chests. Towns employed locks on storehouses and granaries, ensuring that resources could be controlled and rationed. Even modest homes sometimes had simple iron locks, though many still relied on wooden bars. The variety of designs grew. Warded locks with intricate keyholes that accepted only certain keys became common, offering greater security against tampering. The locksmith's art flourished, producing mechanisms that were both functional and ornate. The spread of locks brought profound changes to daily life. In earlier times, safety at night was a communal affair. Families relied on neighbors, watchmen, or community gates for protection. But locks shifted the balance toward individual control. A locked door meant privacy, a concept that grew more significant as locks became common. No longer was the household safety entirely dependent on community vigilance. It could now be secured by a key held in the owner's hand. This transformation reshaped how people thought about home, property, and responsibility. Locks also altered the psychology of fear. A barred door could be forced, a fire could die out, but a lock created a sense of finality. The turning of a key became a ritual, a sound that reassured the heart as much as the mind. To close a door and lock, it was to symbolically shut out the world, to declare that the threshold was protected. Even if locks could be picked or broken, their presence gave peace of mind in ways earlier defenses could not. The transition was gradual. For centuries, many households continued to combine locks with older methods. A door might be both barred with a beam and locked with a key. Families still kept weapons at hand, tended fires, and whispered prayers, layering protections against all possible threats. But slowly, the lock became the centerpiece, the one mechanism that defined the act of securing the home at night. In other parts of the world, locks developed in parallel. In China, wooden and metal locks were used as early as the Han Dynasty, often padlock-style devices with sliding bolts. These locks were practical, portable, and sometimes decorated with symbolic motifs. In India, locksmithing flourished under both Hindu and Islamic traditions, producing intricate designs that blended utility with artistry. The Islamic world, with its centers of learning and craftsmanship, advanced lock technology and spread it through trade across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Despite their spread, locks were never infallible. Skilled thieves learned to pick them, and strong intruders could still break doors. But their psychological power remained. A locked chest deterred casual theft, even if determined criminals could force it. A locked door reassured a family enough to sleep more deeply, even if danger still lingered. The true value of locks lay not only in their mechanics, but in the trust they inspired. Imagine a medieval merchant in a walled town. After closing his shop for the night, he locks the door with an iron key, slips the ring onto his finger, and walks home. At his house, he bars the door, but he also turns the key in the lock. His family gathers, reassured by the sound. Outside, watchmen patrol, but inside, the household feels a new kind of security, the knowledge that a simple object of iron stands guard with them. They settle into sleep with greater peace, trusting not only in walls and rituals, but in the invention of human hands. The rise of locks did not erase older traditions, but it changed their weight. Fire still burned, animals still barked, prayers were still whispered, but the lock became the final act, the gesture that closed the day. Over centuries, this gesture became universal, carried into the modern world until it was so common we rarely think of its history. Yet behind every turn of the key lies a story of fear, ingenuity, and the desire to rest without dread. The transition toward locks was not just technological. It was cultural, emotional, even spiritual. It marked the moment when humanity began to trust less in the collective and more in the individual, less in charms and more in craftsmanship. The lock was not merely a device of wood or iron. It was a turning point in how people faced the night, transforming vulnerability into guarded rest. When we look around at the modern world, it is easy to imagine that the ancient fears of night have been banished. Our homes have locks, alarms, and electric lights. Streets glow with lamps, and security cameras scan corners where shadows once lingered. Yet beneath this layer of technology lies something much older, the legacy of thousands of years of human effort to stay safe in darkness. The practices of our ancestors, fires, barriers, watchmen, animals, and rituals have not disappeared. They live on, transformed, woven quietly into the fabric of how we still approach safety and rest today. Consider the simple act of locking a door before bed. It feels routine, even ordinary, but it carries the same symbolic weight as the beam slid across a medieval cottage door. That click of a deadbolt or turn of a key is more than a mechanical action. It is a ritual, a reassurance that the boundary between inside and outside has been secured. We may no longer think of demons or raiders, but the instinct is the same. Safety comes from marking the threshold, closing it firmly against whatever lies beyond. Fire, humanity's first guardian, continues to echo in our lives as well. Though we rely on electric lights, the principle remains. Illumination drives away fear. Streetlights, porch lights, and night lights in children's rooms are descendants of the campfires and oil lamps of earlier centuries. The soft glow of a lamp on a bedside table is not so different from the embers that once burned in ancient hearths, offering both visibility and comfort. Even the tradition of lighting candles for spiritual or symbolic protection endures, reminding us that light has always been more than utility. It has been safety, reassurance, and a ward against the unknown. The role of animals as guardians is also alive today. Dogs remain beloved companions, but also deterrents, their bark discouraging strangers at doors or windows. In rural areas, farmers still rely on dogs, geese, or donkeys to protect livestock, just as their ancestors did. Even cats, less obvious as protectors, continue their role in households, their alertness and presence reassuring to those who share their homes. The bond between humans and animals, forged in the vulnerable hours of night, remains as strong as ever. Watchmen, too, have their modern counterparts. Security guards patrol malls, factories, and neighborhoods, much like their predecessors who walked medieval streets with lanterns. Police cars cruise roads, their presence both protective and symbolic, echoing the watchman's call of the hour. Even the electronic systems that send silent alerts to monitoring centers carry the same spirit. Someone is awake while we sleep, watching so we do not have to. The principle of vigilance shared across the community is unchanged, though the tools are more advanced. Noise as deterrent has also endured. Burglar alarms, car alarms, and motion-sensitive devices that trigger sounds all serve the same function as rattling pots or clattering shells tied to doorways. Gravel driveways crunch underfoot just as deliberately as the loose stones scattered around ancient thresholds. The idea is timeless. Stealth is the enemy's ally, and sound exposes stealth. Our ancestors turned silence into warning, and we continue to do the same, though with sirens and sensors instead of bells and bones. Rituals and superstitions, too, remain, though they take different forms. Many still say prayers before sleep or place symbolic items near their beds for comfort. Parents check on children, tuck them in, and whisper soothing words that echo lullabies sung for centuries. Some light candles, others leave lights glowing. Still others keep favorite objects nearby. These acts may no longer be labeled as charms, but they serve the same role, creating a sense of safety that goes beyond the physical, helping the mind to let go of fear and embrace rest. Even the rhythms of travel retain echoes of the past. We still prefer to arrive at hotels before nightfall, still seek lit highways and populated rest stops instead of dark, lonely roads. Air travelers, train passengers, or motorists alike feel more at ease when they know their destination will welcome them before dark. The ancient dread of being stranded outside city gates lives on quietly, shaping the way we plan journeys and measure distances. Children remain at the center of nightly safety. Baby monitors, nightlights, and carefully arranged bedrooms are modern tools of an old instinct to protect the most vulnerable while they sleep. Parents today, like parents in Mesopotamia or medieval Europe, listen for every sound, wake at the faintest cry, and place their children in the safest spaces. Technology has changed the tools, but the vigilance remains unchanged, fueled by love and the recognition that night amplifies vulnerability. Community safety, once expressed in town walls and locked gates, now takes new forms. Apartment complexes with secure entry, gated neighborhoods, and surveillance cameras are modern parallels to the moats and watchtowers of the past. The impulse is the same: to enclose, to control entry, to reassure those inside that danger cannot pass unnoticed. Even digital locks, keypads, and smart home systems echo the same ancient instinct, translated into a new language of technology. At the deepest level, what has endured is the balance between fear and reassurance. Night still awakens primal instincts. We may not fear wolves or raiders, but we fear the unknown, the unexpected sound, the possibility of intrusion. To counter this, we layer defenses just as our ancestors did light: barriers, noise, vigilance, rituals. Each layer offers not only practical safety, but psychological comfort, allowing us to surrender to the vulnerability of sleep. Imagine lying in bed today, doors locked, lights glowing softly in the street outside, a dog resting nearby, perhaps a baby monitor humming faintly. You may not think of ancient fires, of charms hung by doors, or of watchmen calling the hours, but those traditions are present, hidden within your environment. The lock on your door is a descendant of Egyptian wooden mechanisms. The light in your hall is kin to the torch burning at a medieval gate. The sound-sensitive alarm echoes the rattling shells of a peasant's threshold, and the prayer whispered by a parent echoes lullabies sung thousands of years ago. The legacy of pre-lock safety reminds us that our struggle against darkness is one of continuity, not rupture. Each generation has built upon the past, refining tools, but keeping the same instincts. We fear, we prepare, we protect, and we rest. Locks may now be small and metallic, alarms digital, lights electric, but they are all part of the same story: humanity's enduring effort to create islands of safety in the sea of night. As much as technology advances, the old rhythms remain within us. We still glance at doors before bed, still listen to the silence, still seek the reassurance of boundaries and companions. The night has always demanded preparation, and we continue to answer, carrying with us the wisdom of countless generations who faced the dark with fire, watchfulness, and hope. We have walked through a long journey, tracing how people across ages and cultures tried to stay safe at night before the invention of modern locks. We've seen fires burn low in ancient hearths, city gates close with final thuds at dusk, dogs stir in the dark, and families whisper prayers before drifting into sleep. Each chapter has revealed a different layer of defense barriers: animals, weapons, rituals, watchmen, noise, and community walls. What emerges is not just a story of survival, but of creativity, resilience, and the deeply human instinct to protect what we love. At the heart of it all was vulnerability. Sleep made everyone defenseless, and the night magnified every danger. To answer this, People drew upon whatever they had: wooden beams, charms, animals, or neighbors to create safety. None of these methods was perfect, but together they built enough reassurance to let people rest. The layers of protection were practical, but they were also symbolic. A bar across a door, a flame in the hearth, a lullaby sung to a child. Each was as much about calming the heart as about warding off danger. And though the tools have changed, the instinct remains the same. Today, we lock doors, install alarms, and light our homes, but these are modern echoes of older practices. The deadbolt is the descendant of the wooden door bar. The street lamp is kin to the torch on the wall. The dog curled on the rug is heir to the guardians who bark outside cottages and tents. Even the rituals remain: parents checking on children, people pausing to pray or reflect before sleep, families drawing together in the evening. The story of night safety before locks reminds us that humanity has always been resourceful. With every challenge, our ancestors found ways to endure, layering defenses against the dark until the morning sun returned. Their struggles and solutions shape the world we inherit, their instincts still alive in our habits. When you turn a key tonight or glance at a light glowing outside your window, you are participating in a tradition thousands of years old, part of a story that stretches back to the first families who huddled around firelight. Thank you for spending this time with me on History for Sleep. I hope the journey has not only eased you toward rest, but also offered perspective on how deeply connected we are to those who came before us. If you enjoyed this exploration, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future stories. Leave a comment below sharing what era or topic you'd like to hear about next. And let us know when you usually listen, whether it's to drift off at night, during a quiet afternoon, or simply when you need calm company. Until next time, may your nights be safe, your sleep be deep, and your dreams carry you gently into the past and back again. Good night.